A country is not just a place to live, it's a brand. It's what the world believes about you. Before they invest, before they visit, before they decide to trust you. And right now, South Africa's brand is taking a hit. Not quietly, not locally, globally. Because what the world is seeing over and over again are videos linked to Operation Dudula.
Citizens targeting immigrants, shops being taken, people being forced out, law being replaced by the streets. That's not order, that's instability. And once a country starts looking unstable, everything connected to it becomes a risk. Tourism becomes a risk. Investment becomes a risk. Partnership becomes a risk. And no serious investor, no serious tourist, no serious partner is going to ignore that signal. But it goes deeper than that because the argument being made is immigrants are taken from the country. But what the world is seeing is something else. South Africans taken from immigrants. So, which is it? Because you can't claim protection while being seen looting on camera. That's contradiction doesn't just weaken the argument, it destroys it. And then there's something even bigger people are overlooking history. End of apartheid did not happen in isolation. It wasn't just internal change. The world applied pressure. African nations stood in solidarity. People across continents protested, sanctioned, and demanded freedom. South Africa didn't just free itself, it was supported into freedom. So, what does it look like today when the same country turns around and target other Africans? What message does that send? Because from the outside, it doesn't look like strength. It looks like forgetting that freedom was not meant to be selective, that dignity was not meant to be conditional, that justice was not meant to stop at the border. And that's where credibility starts to collapse because you cannot benefit from global solidarity and reject it when it returns in a different form. Now, layer in another reality. South Africa is already carrying one of the heaviest public health burden in the world. Millions living with HIV, a system under pressure, a population that still needs stability, support, and growth. And major external support, like the US President's emergency plan for AIDS relief, has been reduced. So ask yourself, is this a moment to project instability? Is this a moment to push away people, energy, and economic activity? Because countries don't grow by closing in, they grow by attracting business, attracting talent, attracting movement. And immigrants are part of that equation. They build, they compete, they create pressure that forces system to evolve. Remove that, and what do you get? A closed system, no pressure, no innovation, stagnation. And let's be honest about something else. This anger, this energy, it's not really about immigrants. It's about frustration. People feeling locked out of ownership, locked out of opportunity, watching others move faster than they know how to. But turning that frustration into vigilantism doesn't fit the system. It exposes it because now the world isn't just seeing struggle, it's seeing a country that cannot control its response to it. It's showing weak leadership. And that's the most dangerous signal of all because investors can work with difficulty, they cannot work with unpredictability. So, what are you really protecting? Because from the outside looking in, this doesn't look like defense. It looks like a country turning against opportunity itself. South Africa has too much potential for this. But if this continues, the cost won't just be reputational, it will be economic, structural, long term. And by the time it fully felt, it may already be too late to reverse.
My name is James Kerr-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security, and statehood during the apartheid era in South Africa. Termed Bantustans, a hybrid word incorporating Bantu, the leading language group in South Africa, with the term Stan, which is often used to designate countries in Central Asia. These homelands were deliberately designed to reinforce the institutionalized racism of the apartheid system. To this end, they attracted considerable international condemnation. So, how were they created, and what eventually happened to them? At 1.2 million square kilometres or 470,000 square miles, South Africa is the 24th largest country in the world. It borders 6 other states: Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Eswatini, and Lesotho, the last of which is one of only 2 UN members completely surrounded by another country. The population is currently estimated to be around 60 million. According to the 2011 census, 80% of citizens are black Africans, followed by coloureds or mixed race, who account for around 9%. Whites are 8%, and 2.5% are Asian or Indian. Highly diverse, the country has 11 official languages. The most prevalent of these is Zulu, spoken as a first language by around 23% of the population. Xhosa is second, amounting to around 16%. Third and fourth are Afrikaans and English. South Africa has a history stretching back thousands of years. However, our story really starts with the arrival of the first European explorers in the 15th century. By the start of the 17th century, the Dutch had established a settlement at the Cape of Good Hope, and in the century and a half that followed, this community expanded and gradually developed its own distinct Afrikaner identity. This eventually saw the creation of 2 Afrikaner states in the 1850s, the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. Meanwhile, South Africa steadily became important to Britain as a vital staging point for ships travelling to India. Having seized control of the Cape in 1795, Britain expanded its holdings across southern Africa over the course of the following century, fighting wars with various groups, including the Zulu. This expansion eventually brought Britain into conflict with the Dutch-speaking republics, and this came to a head with a series of wars at the end of the 19th century. In 1902, Britain officially annexed the South African Republic and the Orange Free State following the Second Boer War. Then, 8 years later, on the 31st of May 1910, the various colonies and territories were merged to become the Union of South Africa, a dominion of the British Empire. This would last until 1931, when South Africa, alongside other dominions such as Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, effectively obtained complete independence under the Statute of Westminster, albeit retaining the British monarch as head of state. Despite the long history of British control and the significant growth in English speaking settlers, most of South Africa's white inhabitants remained Afrikaans speakers. However, there were deep divisions within the community. While many saw a country where British and Afrikaners created a single national South African identity, others felt that the two should remain distinct. This led to the creation of the National Party in 1914. In 1948, the party eventually came to power following a general election. Although it had now seemingly abandoned its policy of separating the white communities, it still clung to the idea of racial separation more widely. While there'd been a long history of discrimination against black South Africans, including the notorious National Land Act in 1913, which deprived them of their right to own land in white-held areas, the National Party now instituted a formal policy of racial segregation, a system that came to be known as apartheid. In 1950, the Population Registration Act required all South Africans to be defined as black, white, or coloured. And at the same time, the Group Areas Act set up separate residential and business areas for the different races. This all permitted the Interior Minister to remove non-whites from territory and areas designated for whites only, a provision that would eventually see millions of black South Africans forcibly evicted from their lands. It was against this backdrop that the Bantustans would eventually become a key plank in the apartheid system, but it would in fact take several decades to happen. The first critical moment came in 1951, a quarter of a century before the first nominally independent Bantustan was created, when the South African government passed the Bantu Authorities Act. This gave authority to tribal leaders and councils within the area of the traditional homelands. This was followed in 1959 when the government passed the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act, which laid down the possibility of self-rule for the areas. 2 years later, amidst growing international criticism over its racist policies at home and its refusal to decolonise neighbouring Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia, South Africa abolished the Queen as head of state, becoming the Republic of South Africa. This now appeared to lift the brakes on formally establishing the homelands, which were at first designated self-governing territories. In 1963, Transkei, in the country's southeast, became the first of what would eventually be 10 Bantustans in South Africa. On top of this, a further 10 autonomous homelands were also designated in Southwest Africa. This was followed in 1970 with the Homeland Citizenship Act, which made every black South African a citizen of one of the homelands, regardless of their current residency. But the most crucial step came in March 1971 with the Bantu Homelands Constitution Act. This empowered the government to grant independence to any of the homelands. Seeing the direction that this was going, this sparked an international outcry. In November 1971, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution condemning the creation of the self-governing Bantustans and the forcible relocation of people to those areas, arguing that the policies were designed to set one tribe against another and weaken the rights of black Africans. This was later reiterated in another General Assembly resolution that called upon all governments and organisations not to deal with any institutions of the Bantustans or to accord them any form of recognition. But despite the warnings and opposition, South Africa pressed ahead with the idea, announcing the creation of the first independent homeland, the Republic of Transkei, on the 26th of October 1976. The domestic effects of this were immediate and devastating. Every black South African assigned Transkei citizenship at a stroke became a foreigner in South Africa. Again, the General Assembly condemned the move and called on UN members not to recognise them as states or to have any dealings with them. But while the Security Council also reiterated this, South Africa was undeterred. Instead, it created three more: Bophuthatswana in 1977, Venda in 1979, and Ciskei in 1981, the so-called TBVC states. Crucially, these new entities, which in the case of Bophuthatswana was made up of a disparate collection of territories across northern South Africa, were never recognised by any UN members. Even Lesotho, which had a boundary with Transkei, resisted, despite significant pressure from South Africa, a position that was eventually praised by the UN Security Council. As a side note, and for the avoidance of any confusion, the Bantustan legislation didn't create either Lesotho or Swaziland, now known as Eswatini. They were in fact separate British protectorates that became independent states in October 1966 and September 1968 respectively, and were admitted as members of the United Nations soon afterwards. So, whatever happened to the Bantustans? In short, the end of apartheid brought about their demise. Following decades of pressure and an increasingly tight sanctions regime, the system of apartheid finally started to crumble towards the end of the 1980s. In 1990, the 10 self-governing Bantustans in Southwest Africa disappeared when South Africa finally withdrew from the territory and Namibia became an independent member of the United Nations. Meanwhile, South Africa itself now moved towards a post-apartheid era, as multi-party talks led to an agreement on an interim constitution for a multiracial democracy. The UN General Assembly called on the new South African government to secure the peaceful reincorporation of the homelands into the country. Over the following months, South Africa prepared to take over the Bantustans. While Transkei and Venda, both under military rule, accepted the decision, the other two, Ciskei and Bophuthatswana, initially resisted. This would lead to a crisis. Facing a strike by civil servants who supported the reintegration, Lucas Mangope, the president of Bophuthatswana, called for help from Afrikaner nationalists. But as this turned to violence, the military mutinied, and on the 11th of March, Mangope fled. The following day, the South African government formally appointed an interim administrator, and at this point, Ciskei also fell into line and accepted reincorporation. On the 27th of April 1994, the first day of the interim constitution, the South African Parliament repealed the legislation that had created the Bantustans, not only the four nominally independent ones, but also the six others operating under self-rule. Instead, the new constitutional order would apply to all parts of the country, and South Africa would become a united state. Ultimately, the Bantustans were a fascinating case of statehood in international relations. While it's generally accepted that countries should have every right to determine their borders and allow parts of their territory to become independent if they so wish, this wasn't the case here. Instead, the international community viewed their independence as a cynical move to support a racist system and thus rejected it. Interestingly and unusually, the case against their recognition wasn't therefore based on their capacity to be states, as is sometimes the case, although it was suggested that their economic and political reliance on South Africa called into question whether they could in fact be truly considered to be independent. Instead, international condemnation emerged because they were deliberately designed to thwart the human rights and self-determination of the majority black population of South Africa. Their existence emanated from a desire to support the racist policy of apartheid, which was judged to be a crime against humanity.
If this breakdown gave you something to think about, make sure you like, subscribe, and share. And stay tuned for another episode of What is Going On Media, where we make the complicated clear.